I imagine we'll get a few more folks, but thanks for being here. Whether this is your first of this sort of series or your third, it's good to have you here. I know that last week, Alyssa, I think she went over some of the pieces of the Shachrit Amidah that we do on the Yamim Noraim, and a couple weeks ago when it was me, we went over the special additions to the Shachrit Musaf Amidah on Rosh Hashanah. And so tonight, to make sure we touch on Yom Kippur, this is very much like I don't know if the term we used was boot camp, but it's like the goal is to be a little bit of a survey so that we can look at some of these texts before we actually daven them in the next couple weeks. So because Yom Kippur is so much liturgy, last year when I taught this, I think I did like slightly smaller section, like I took a small bite out of a lot of parts of Yom Kippur. This time I'm taking a slightly larger or a slightly deeper dive into a few parts. So we're going to look at Kol Nidre, the text itself, some of the, sort of like bullet point ideas and facts around the service, and do a similar thing with Vidui, the confessional, which is made up of Ashamnu and the Al-Chet section. And then similarly with, we'll look at Ne'ilah, the way we close the service, and specifically look at one piyut that kicks it off. It's called El Nora Alilah. So that's a good overview. I'll try to sort of toggle between sharing my screen and not sharing my screen so that when, we have moments to share reflections or reactions, I can see you all. And as of now, we all fit on one Zoom screen. So it's nice to be able to see who's here. But I'll also share my source sheet. Yep, Joyce read my mind. I will share the source sheet and I'll also share my screen so you can, do what works for you. So give me 1 second here. I have a Google Doc here. All right. Just want to make sure that works for everyone. Folks have it open. Is that a nod, a thumbs up? I think I would know if it wasn't working at this point. Great. Okay. So I'm also going to share my screen so that, we can just work through it together. I like that a little bit more. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So here we are. Let's start by looking at Kol Nidre. Like I said, I think that even if we haven't done a deep dive into this prayer before, I think a lot of folks who only go to shul even every now and then, we know the term Kol Nidre. We associate it with Yom Kippur. It's just what we think of as the name of the sort of evening service of Yom Kippur. It's actually just the name of the prayer that opens up the service, but I think it's become very colloquial to say, what are you doing for Kol Nidre, right? We sort of that's what we call Erev Yom Kippur, that evening is Kol Nidre. So, I think the thing to really keep in mind as we go through this text, I'm going to read it out loud in a moment, is why is this the prayer that kicks off Yom Kippur? And I don't know if we're necessarily going to get a satisfying or a clear answer. We'll get some insight, some answers, but that's the question that I think is sort of important to discuss and try to parse out. And I'm curious, what strikes you and why you think this ends up being this really fundamental, formal part of the service. So I will read the translation very slowly, and we'll go from there. So, Kol Nidre. All vows and things we have made forbidden on ourselves, and oaths, and items we have consecrated to the temple, and vows issued with the expression konam, and vows which are abbreviated, and vows with the expression kanos, that we have vowed and sworn and dedicated and made forbidden upon ourselves. This is important. From this Yom Kippur until next Yom Kippur, may it come to us at a good time. We regret having made them. May they all be permitted, forgiven, eradicated, and nullified, and may they not be valid or exist any longer. Our vows shall no longer be vows, and our prohibitions shall no longer be prohibited, and our oaths are no longer oaths. So this question that I have here is often the first question I like to ask when I look at any text, but sort of it's like, what's going on here? Like in your own words, what's going on here? But to put it in another way, what do you notice about this text? What stands out? And maybe what are your immediate questions? So I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment and see if there are any initial reactions to the text and to the question as I posed it. Joyce, is that a hand? Is that yes? Yeah, Joyce, please.
It's in Aramaic for one thing.
Great observation. Okay, it's in Aramaic, and we'll touch on that in a moment. But yeah, it's in Aramaic. What else stood out to you? Is that what you were mostly going to bring up, or was there something else?
I'll let others bring up.
Okay, great. So it's in Aramaic. Sheila, what's on your mind? Sheila, I think you're still muted. There we go.
Okay. I've always thought, since I first heard it, that it was meant to be a prayer that everyone in the congregation would say together, because some of the people would have, because of stress and being in a very bad situation and among people who hated Jews, had perhaps pretended to convert to other religion, or had pretended they were no longer Jewish and said that to authorities. And I've always thought that this was a way, maybe it was the only time of the year that they came back, and was the only time that the whole congregation sits it with them in order that they feel at home. It's just I don't know.
Oh, interesting. Well, what's interesting about what you're saying?
What?
Well, what's interesting about what you're saying is that it's in contrast to this prayer actually being offered usually by like a shaliach tzibur, like a prayer leader on behalf of the community. Like I was just talking about this with a classmate today. The line right before Kol Nidre is Anu matirin lehitpalel im ha'avaryanim. We give permission to everyone else to pray with the sinners, meaning it's like you are offering this prayer to God on behalf of your community. But you know, I think that there's something powerful about whenever we say a prayer all together, especially you know, the Yom Kippur liturgy in general. We're going to touch on this later in the session. So you alluded to something interesting, because it's so much about carrying this burden. A lot of it is written in first person plural, not first person singular, when talking about sinning, which is really interesting. So you're already picking up on something that I think is a trend of the holiday. And yet this is also a prayer that's typically prayed alone, sort of performed for us, offered on our behalves. So there's an interesting tension there. Yeah, Sandy, what about you? What are your initial thoughts or observations?
Well, I think especially because you pointed out the time period, but it is confusing, because if you didn't listen carefully, you'd think you're talking about the past, but in fact, it's framing it for the future. So it's from this time till next Yom Kippur, but it's the time frame that's confusing me. I think there's to be understood about that. That's probably really important, but I don't know what it is.
No, I mean, I don't have a clear answer either. It is interesting though. There's something going on here where the notion of vows are so significant that it's such a thing that we are not supposed to break a vow, that we are actually going into this year saying, if and when we inevitably make vows that we can't keep, please, right now, as we are praying to you on this holiest day of the year, let's get ahead of this. Not only have we just spent all this time reflecting over the last 10 days and over the last month about everything we have done in the past year. But now we're already recognizing that we are fallible. And this sin specifically seems to be of such importance that we want to say, hey, please forgive us now. Please, God, know that we didn't mean it. We didn't mean to make the vow that we weren't going to keep, which sort of leads me to my next question, which is, what's the deal with vows? Why are vows the headliner of the Yom Kippur service? I mean, I guess you could argue they're the opener, but it's like if you've got, two big acts, an opener's opening up for a really big deal headliner. Like, it's clearly like, it's an act you've heard of. Jeremy, I just want to say only vows between you and God, not between you and another person. Yeah, that is an important thing to qualify. We are talking about vows between us and God. And that's an important qualifier, actually, of sort of teshuvah in general on Yom Kippur, is that what our prayer does on this holiday is it works things out between us and God. And the forgiveness that we're seeking between us and other people, or in this case, vows that we might break between us and other people, that's not sorted out through this prayer. That's sorted out by, direct person-to-person teshuvah. In fact, I'm going to share my screen just for a brief moment before I let folks react to this vows thing. Just a couple of interesting side texts I like to put in, which is that we read in Mishnah Yoma that this prayer is actually what can absolve us of our sins between us and God, not just the day itself. Like, for some people, it's like, oh, Yom Kippur, that's the day where things work out. And this Mishnah points out that it's when we say this prayer, specifically the saying of this prayer, that starts to work out this teshuvah, this forgiveness that we're working out between us and God, specifically around vows. Yeah, Sonia.
Essentially, very simply, it reads to me like we'd like to start over. We'd like to clean the slate, clear the slate. What struck me is we regret having made them. So we regret having made vows, or maybe I'm not sure what that means. And then may they all be permitted. So that confuses me. Is it the things that we did that went against the vows that we made, may they be permitted? And why would we want to ask for that when vows are so important? So I'm very confused by it. May they be permitted? May they all be permitted, forgiven, eradicated, nullified? May they not be valid and exist any longer? It starts out, all vows and things we have made forbidden on ourselves, not against God, and oaths and items we have consecrated to the temple. May that all be, in a sense, wiped away. And yes, what is the meaning of it if we're asking for an eradication? I mean, it sounds a little bit purifying in a sense, it certainly sounds poignant and pleading and humble, but it doesn't sound like we're people who want to stick to our vows in a sense. Because every year we have this opportunity to say, forget about it, forgive us, and permit something. I don't know what it's asking for permission for. Permission for, I'm not sure. So I'll stop.
Yeah, I mean, I am also a little unsure. I think my initial read is that what's going on is that we're talking about something of such severity that whether it were to shake out in such a situation that it would need to be permitted, or it would shake out in such a way that it would need to be forgiven, or it would shake out in such a way that it would need to be eradicated, depending on the level of ability to follow through on the vow, or having needed to make the vow or not in the first place. We are trying to cover our bases because clearly something is so serious about a vow. And at the very least, we can start to see where this comes from. That's up to us to sort of discern why it seems to be so important to God. but it shows up in the Tanakh in a couple of places. I brought in one of the sources because, again, we're only going to do Kol Nidre for some of our time tonight. But to take a look at this, in Bamidbar, chapter 30, verse 3, we read, if a householder makes a vow to God or takes an oath imposing an obligation or a prohibition on themselves, they shall not break their pledge. They must carry out all that has crossed their lips. So there's another verse of this regard. And I share this here. We have a full Masechet of the Talmud. Nedarim is an entire tractate about vows. So it brings me back to the question I already brought up. Knowing that these two verses that we're basing this off of, but a full tractate of the Gemara is called Nedarim. It really, there's not a right answer. Why do you think our tradition sees this as such a serious offense? Do you relate to vows with a similar feeling of seriousness? Marissa, please. You're muted.
Thank you. It's very interesting to me. And if I can get Mark to come in here, it might be clearer than what I'm about to say. But Mark did a lot of work on promises, on keeping promises, and what that means, particularly to children who have promises made to them and whether they're kept or not. And there's an interesting connection between making and keeping promises and time perspective. That the idea that a promise is made or a vow is made and kept or not kept impacts particularly children's perception of time passing. And when I'm reading this, it's interesting to me that that we have a time limit on this, because we only have to wait another year before this is going to come around again, and we get to do it again. And in that context, it's all about time, and it's all Heschel here, as you know, it's time and space, and I'm wondering whether anyone else sees vows, these kinds of vows, as promises that we've made to ourselves during the year, promises that we've made to others, and or more importantly, promises that we've made to God, and what that means for us as the year progresses.
No, I appreciate you bringing the word promise in, because I think it started to make me think about it in like a personal sense of what does it mean when you experience someone who's broken a promise, and how painful that can be. And so maybe we're getting at something here that is relational. Maybe we're recognizing that vows are much more than just this legal construct, but that when we make a vow between us and another person, or us and God, we're taking a huge risk, because something about clearly the fallout of not fulfilling a vow is so much greater even than the merit or the goodness that comes of following through with the vow, right? Because as much as the Tanakh is just saying, don't mess it up, it looks like the rabbis take it one step further. Okay, so I'm going to read a short section from Nedarim, and I think it shows that the rabbis are so afraid of the idea of breaking a vow that they essentially do what we see our tradition do a lot, and they build a huge fence around the whole concept. So they say, we read here, Rava said to Rav Nachman, Master, see that sage who came from the west, from Eretz Israel, and said that the sages attended to the dissolution of a vow taken by the son of Rav Huna bar Avin, and they dissolved his vow, and they said to him, go and request mercy for yourself, for you have sinned by taking a vow. As Rav Dimi, the brother of Rav Safra, teaches, with regard to anyone who takes a vow, even if they fulfill it, he is called a sinner. Rav Zavid said, what verse teaches this? It is, but if you refrain to vow, it will be no sin in you. It may be inferred that if you did not refrain from taking vows, there is sin. So I think that's fascinating, right? Is that we're now actually reaching a point that it's like, you know what, don't make a vow at all. We don't even make a vow at all. And yet we start Kol Nidre by saying, forgive us for the vows that we're inevitably going to make and break. So the tradition teaches at the same time, sinning is breaking a vow is a sin, don't vow at all. And you know what? Our most famous prayer, the one that everyone's heard of, it's all about acknowledging that we're fallible and that we need God to forgive us because we're going to make promises we can't keep. And there is something so, in my opinion, beautiful about a tradition that is both aspirational and also in touch with what it means to be human and fallible. In fact, I think I saw that word aspirational pop up. Claire, you shared, are vows aspirational? If so, then it makes sense that we wouldn't achieve them all. And I think that's a beautiful idea and an interesting one to think about in concert with the idea that, sure, on one hand, it's like, don't make a vow at all. But on the other hand, we're offering this prayer where we acknowledge that we are going to make vows in the next year, even though the prayer is rooted in a concept that teaches us don't make them at all. So I think that's fascinating. Oh yeah, Judy, please.
Yes. What is the connection between the commandment not to take God's name in vain? And is that part of the issue of a vow, that the severity of making a vow? Because I assume that I swear to God is what a vow might be.
Yeah, I don't know if those are directly tied, but it seems like a really good argument. And my guess is that that connection has been made, right? Because it's in there with what you said, taking the name in vain, right? It's the same idea of like breaking a vow. It's a vow made in vain, and it's a commitment to God specifically. Yeah, Joyce.
So I think there are times biblically where vows have been as part of the stories that we have read. Eli with Tfilat Chana, for instance, there's a vow in that, I believe.
Oh, interesting. Right, right.
And I think there's another, I can't remember which one, but there is another biblical, story that also includes a vow.
Right. There are definitely vows. In fact, it's one of the more upsetting narratives where Judah has made a vow to his daughter-in-law, and he doesn't fulfill the vow in terms of what he owes her by way of, like, her husband dies, as in his son, and then she seduces him, and she acts like she's like essentially she seduces him without him knowing that she's his daughter-in-law, and she has proof of the vow that he made to her, and she sort of it's an upsetting story, but also it's one that shows both the slippery slope and also the power of vows, because she is protected despite a tradition that would look very would frown upon, like, a woman having sex out of any sort of marriage construct, which the narrative tries to paint her as this villain. She then has proof of this vow, and she is protected, and in fact has her, like, the vow redeemed. So yeah, it's a very interesting, fraught thing that we see throughout the Tanakh. Okay, well, I want to make sure we divide our time thoughtfully, so I'm gonna move us along just to some other things to have on our radars about Kol Nidre. So I'm going to share my screen here. So a little bit of a history. The exact date of the origin of the prayer is unknown, but we know that it was present by the Gaonic period, the late 6th century. As Joyce pointed out, it's written in Aramaic, right? So vows are very much a legal construct, and that's Aramaic is a legal language. It reflects the legal language and the spoken language versus prayers that are in Hebrew. This is what's really interesting. Me asking the question of, like, why is this what starts Yom Kippur? It's been asked for a long time because a lot of scholars discredited this prayer. So Rav Yehuda Gaon, he says, we do not ascribe to the custom of annulling vows on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. However, we heard that in other countries they say Kol Nidre. We did not hear about this from our teachers. And then Rav Amram Gaon says, Kol Nidre is a foolish custom and it is forbidden to say it. Obviously, these guys didn't win out because now we say it everywhere. And then just a little bit to set the scene. So when we say the prayer, we take out the Torah scrolls and we hold them. The prayer is repeated 3 times. On this evening, due to sort of like the important holy nature of this evening, it's the only night of the year that we wear our talitots. Here's a really interesting set of instructions around the prayer from an 11th century Siddur. So the first time the cantor must utter the prayer very softly, like one who hesitates to enter the palace of the king to ask a gift of him whom he fears to approach. The second time he may speak somewhat louder, and the third time more loudly still, as one who is accustomed to dwell at a court and to approach his sovereign as a friend. So there's something very dramatic about the way that we initially start this very cautiously. I think there's a lot of theater in the Kol Nidre and all the sort of Yamim Noraim liturgy, especially Yom Kippur. But I think that theater, the way we dramatize a lot of the prayer experience, is to help us, it's to evoke a feeling, right? Like, I don't think it's theater for theater's sake. It's the same way prayer is a tool, and like the words of the prayer and the melody of the prayer, the choreography is also a resource to help us feel a feeling, right? So we talked about this 2 weeks ago, the Grand Aleinu, fully prostrating ourselves, right? That is a way to feel the grandness of the day, to fully prostrate ourselves before God. And the way that the tune gradually gets bigger and louder and more involved, means we're entering cautiously, but we're starting to maybe build some confidence, or maybe start to feel some type of energy about, the sort of shpilkus we can feel when we really confront feelings of vulnerability or of intense emotional, importance, right? We're talking about, forgive us, God, like, let us live to see another year. And we'll see that in other parts of the service, and that we'll sort of look at tonight. So, my closing question here was, why, of all things, does Kol Nidre begin the holy day of Yom Kippur? I think we've sort of addressed that. But if anyone else wants to weigh in, otherwise, I'm happy to move on to Vidui. Joy shared, though, it's interesting that so many musical artists have made recordings of the Kol Nidre prayer, and one of our local stations made it a point to play it during the week. Yeah, I mean, it's this very haunting tune. As someone who has a decent singing voice, but is not a chazan, but I led High Holidays for Hillel for a bunch of years, it's a really hard tune to sing. I'm able to do it like 75% of the way you're supposed to. Like, I can't get low enough and high enough in the same key to actually really do it the justice that, like, Ari is going to do it. Yeah, Sandy.
Yeah, so I have a thought that a brand new thought to me about why is this important. And here's the idea that beginning on Rosh Hashanah, we start with Hamelech and acknowledge God as sovereign, and the great Aleinu, the prostration, in other words, submission.
Yeah.
And acknowledgement of the greatness of God. And what is a vow but saying, this is what I'm going to do? It's you deciding what you're going to do in advance.
Mm.
But if you actually are submitting to God and wanted to be his instrument, you'd have to be flexible to do whatever is necessary in the moment. So I don't know, it might sound a little out there, but I don't know, that kind of appeals to me. That it's saying, I'm not going to put myself in the control seat completely here. I'm going to be willing to listen and do what is necessary, rather than try to anticipate everything.
Yeah, that's I think that's a huge part of the liturgy on these holidays. It's a certain sort of surrender that we're speaking to, and it can be hard to access, and it can be really powerful if we can get in touch with it, and that's why I think shul on the Yamim Norim, it has a different feel. There's a different energy in the room very often. There's a very different energy over, or the Zoom screen, however you're experiencing it. It just feels different. I think it's palpable.
Well, and there's some Torah too about a father can annul his daughter's or his wife's vows if he wants. They can't, but he can. I don't remember what part of the Torah it's in, but it was explained to me that it might even be like an eating disorder and they're denying themselves food for whatever reason. And so the father can say that's over. You're not doing that anymore. So it kind of fits in with maybe you don't know best. Who knows? So anyway.
Yeah, I can't speak to that as much, mostly because those sort of texts I read with a different sort of critical eye, but I can see how there might be some overlap conceptually. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Marissa, we're gonna hear from you, and then we're gonna start with the Dewey.
Thank you. I'm gonna. It seems to me, given what Sandy said, that one of the things that's interesting at this moment to me is how these personal vows that we've made, this interaction, these promises that we're making back and forth with God, they also have impact on the people around us. We don't make a promise, we don't make a vow without people being impacted by it. And so it's interesting that the vidui is how we've trespassed and we've betrayed, with this understanding that whatever these vows we've made also, to me, in thinking about it now, also impact the community that we force people into these transgressions, if you will, and how we apologize for them, and how we create the mood and how we create a community by making promises, by making vows. So
that's a great segue, and also gives me a little bit more to think about in terms of why the we, because you're right, inherently in vows, especially ones that are not between us and God, but us and other people, we implicate others in some form or another. So I think that gives another reason to the we language, and what a perfect transition. So I'm going to share my screen. And again, we'll jump into now the Vidui section. I'm going to do something a little out of order. Am I? No, I misunderstood something. Where was the thing I wanted to read? Sorry about this. You know what? Let's just go in. Let's look at the text. Okay, so this is also probably a very famous text to a lot of us. If it's not jumping out immediately, it might be. This might help trigger a memory. It's the part we put our hand over our chest, and the tune that's very famous is the Ashamnu, and we pound our chest. And notable that in Hebrew, the suffix nun vav nu means in past tense, we have done something. Okay, so we have trespassed. Ashamnu, we have trespassed. Bagadnu, we have betrayed. Gazalnu, we have stolen. Dibarnu dofi, we have slandered. He'evinu, we have caused others to sin. Vehirshanu, we have caused others to become wicked. Zadnu, we have sinned with malicious intent. Chamasnu, we have committed violence. Tafalnu, sheker, we have added falsehood upon falsehood. Yatsnu ra, we have joined with evil individuals or groups. Kizavnu, we have given harmful advice. Latsnu, we have deceived. Maradnu, we have mocked. Niatsnu, we have rebelled. Sararnu, we have caused God to be angry with us. Avinu, we have turned away from goodness. Pashanu, we have sinned deliberately. Sararnu, we have been negligent. Kishinu oref, we have caused our friends grief. Rashanu, we have been stiff-necked. Shichatnu, we have been wicked. Tiavnu, we have committed sins of moral corruption. Tainu, we have committed abominations. Titanu, we have gone astray. We have led others astray. So I'll let that sink in. I'll hopefully the text is still, I actually will put it in the chat again in case anyone has joined us since we started. But I'll ask you to just take a moment to look over them and see if what's resonating, what's standing out. But yeah, I'm curious, like, what parts resonate? Are there parts that feel painful to say? Oh, thank you, Joyce. You beat me to it. So I'll keep sharing my screen then. Are there parts that feel painful to say? Are there things you would skip or things that you would add? I just think it's interesting because this is the text that we will really go at. I mean, I think we say this 10 times during Yom Kippur. And so I think it's worth processing, thinking about these words a little bit in advance. So yeah, what stands out? What are folks thinking? Yeah, Joyce.
So, well, aside from the plural, which was the second point that you made on your source sheet, that even if we ourselves didn't do all these sins, that collectively we're responsible for sins that our community has committed. That we take, that there's that saying, Kol Yisrael Arayvim Zeh Lazeh, meaning that everybody is responsible, all of Israel is responsible for one another, that we take that responsibility seriously during this time.
Yeah. I posed this very question to the teens of BJ on Saturday night. I was leading a Selihot program. And we talked about the we, because we looked at the Ashamnu text. And they had a lot of beautiful answers. And one of them that stuck with me was they appreciated the idea that, first of all, our actions inherently affect others, and that we perhaps enable others to sin and others enable us to sin. And also something that stood out was that admitting that we've done something wrong is really, really hard and takes a lot of vulnerability. But something about saying it collectively can perhaps soften that burden, right? When we can communally acknowledge that we're wrapped up in this together and that we've all done this. And again, I see the slippery slope here about at what point are we not taking accountability at all? But what if this is a way of understanding this is like an important first step? That by saying we, it's easier for me to admit it, but at least I'm admitting it, that I've done X, Y, Z, right? And then from there, I can start to maybe parse out what I really need to take an additional level of personal accountability for. Yeah, what are any other thoughts or reactions? The plural, the things that are included, the things that are omitted. Yeah, Marissa.
I'm sorry, but Mark
Please,
and I,
please don't apologize.
Mark and I, we spent a lot of time talking about this today, and my grandson is getting ready for his bar mitzvah in March. So we've been spending a lot of time talking about morality and passing on traditions and heritage and blah, blah, blah. And one of the things that Mark was very vocal about at lunch today was this list of sins, this list of bad doings that we say, well, we beat our breasts, but we don't have a list that says, on the other hand, we work at the soup kitchen, we hug our children, we say good morning to strangers on the street when we walk by. Mark paid for somebody's peaches the other day because they didn't have enough to. I mean, you get what I'm saying, is that while we're focused on these sins, these things that we've done that have been harmful, we don't, as a community, and particularly at this time, we don't balance this with the good things, the wondrous things except for the locks situation. I think that BJ does a great job of reaching out and doing, I don't care about the lock situation, but BJ does a wonderful job of reaching out, and there are things that we should be proud of. Should we not be saying to our children when we bring them to shul, when we say this, that there is a balance? We also make promises that we're going to take care of one another, that in COVID, we made sure that people got their shots, that we blah, 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 blah. All of the good things that we do, that it should be easy for me to articulate, how easy to articulate the sin, but not so easy to articulate the values, the things that we do well and should be proud of.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of good responses, I think, already to you from Sandy, and from Joyce. So Joyce points out that there's this Rav Kook teaching that is like ahavnu, berachnu, we've loved, we have blessed. And then Sandy points out we only have one day for atonement, right? And so I think that's a nice piece of sort of tochacha, which is that we have so many other moments, ideally in a community that's functioning really thoughtfully, to offer hakarat hatov, like acknowledgement of the good. But yeah, you're absolutely right that it is an intense thing to acknowledge all of this. I also just want to point out that Sandy, I think you mentioned you're surprised by how many of these have to do with speech. And so I still see the queue of folks I want to hear from, but I want to just bring something in real quick, which is interestingly connected to the idea that so many of these things have to do with speech. Because also, I brought in this piece here from the Mishnah Torah. It's right now we've been doing laws of repentance between Mincha and Mariv on Zoom each night. So if you were there the very first night, this probably would have been the one they taught, which is if a person transgresses any of the mitzvot of the Torah, whether a positive command or a negative command, whether willingly or inadvertently, when one repents and returns from their sins, one must confess before God. Blessed be God, as it states in the Torah, if a person commits any of the sins of humankind, they must confess the sin that they committed. This refers to a verbal confession. This confession is a positive command. How does one confess? One states, I implore you, God, I sinned, I transgressed, I committed iniquity before you by doing the following. Behold, I regret and am embarrassed for my deeds. I promise never to repeat this act again. These are essential elements of the confessional prayer. Whoever confesses profusely and elaborates on these matters is worthy of praise. So I brought this up in response to Sandy because maybe, yes, so many of them are verbal sins because we're actually supposed to verbally confess, right? So there just ends up being a natural connection. But I also just wanted to make sure that we brought that in, which we do say all of these blessings at some point silently, but also several times out loud. So I think whether or not we want to respond to these prompts right now, does the idea of a verbal confession resonate, right? Does it feel like it needs to be verbal to fulfill this notion of the commandment of really repenting for a sin, to verbally confess? So I'll let that float as well, but I want to hear from Sonia and Tony.
Thank you. I'm really basically going to address this communal nature of the confessional in the voice of we. And to me, it's astounding that all of these sins we are admitting to. I find it astounding because it's human nature, and certainly we know this with regard politically, and the way things are going in the world, in this country in particular. We're so quick, and probably within our families, to point the finger and say, he did this, she did that. We gossip, we blame one another, we malign one another. And when we say, and some of us, we don't all do these sins. We're not violent. We don't, anyway, I think I'm making the point. I find it astounding that the prayer brings us together collectively as a responsible community for our behavior. It's so powerful. I love it emotionally. I find it, it really touches, I guess, a kind of a need in me to, to join in others, let's say, confessional pain, even if I'm not feeling that I've particularly sinned. It just feels good to share it, to share the burden, and to share it really honestly. I mean,
Yeah.
this is serious stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. And I've thought a lot about how we are often very resistant to teshuva. There is something, I think, almost natural that like our defenses go up, because I think it's hard to acknowledge that we've done something wrong. I think I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think there's a point in our lives where it's just hard to make that acknowledgement. And what's so fascinating about it is that the we language acknowledges that teshuva takes place between multiple parties, right? And that I have found that the more I've been able to let go of the defensiveness and the blinders sort of trying to keep me away from the things that I need to be held accountable for, and the more I'm able to actually engage in meaningful and honest and direct and collective teshuva, it's healing, right? It can be so liberating. And I agree. I do think a lot about the way spaces like these could theoretically play a really big role in causing or creating healing in a country, in a world, in a community that can feel fractured. And very often, the first step is just folks being willing to be able to come to the table, despite those differences, despite that energy, despite the wrongdoings between two parties. And that's I think the hardest part. I think the rest of it can be messy, but at that point, you've done the hardest part. Yeah, Tony, please. You've been waiting very patiently. You're still muted.
First of all, it seems that there are other lists. Would they just be other translations? Because it seems that there are other times we say these words, these lists with different words.
So what we're about to do in a moment is we're going to go to the Al Chet section, which is part 2 of
Oh,
VDP,
maybe that's okay.
which is like a way longer list of even more sins.
But the thing here that I'm noticing is some of these have to do with what we have done by ourselves. And many of them seem to have to do with what we're taking responsibility for others' actions, like we caused others to sin, others to become wicked. How is it that others don't have responsibility for what they've done? How is it that we're at fault or altogether at fault? I mean, you go through this list and there are several places here where we've led others astray. Like, okay, others were willing to be led astray. How is that all our fault? So I just wonder about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of the implication is that empowering or emboldening or enabling someone else to sin makes you like party to sin, right? And that in itself is a sin, right? Like the idea of like, being a co-conspirator. Maybe you didn't pull the trigger, but you served as a decoy. That you might not be charged with, right? Like an accomplice is what Joyce put in the chat. I think that's sort of the idea. And yeah, I think there's just something about perhaps it's easier to speak in we language throughout the section if we at least actually make reference to things that were collective sins and not only things that are personal sins. Maybe there's actually some, logic behind it. I'm not sure.
Well, then where are we where the person who we have caused sin, how does that, where is that person who says, oh, it's his fault, he caused me to do it? I mean, somewhere here, that's just what I'm wondering about.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at, which is really an important point, is that there's a very good chance that every year we are saying we have X, Y, or Z over things that we actually didn't do, right? Is that part of this exhaustive list is that it's in some ways supposed to be a one size fits all, perhaps. But on the other hand, maybe it's supposed to make space for and acknowledge that if it wasn't this year, it could have been next year, it could be last year. It's like a constant reminder that like these are the things that we are likely to fall subject to, right? And that's actually why I'm curious about what doesn't feel appropriate on this list, which is what you were starting to share, and what feels like it's missing, right? So I'm going to actually use this as an opportunity to transition us just a little bit. I want to get to the Al-Khayd section, which is even longer. And in order to do that, I'm going to read this little text from Rabbi Deborah Ornstein, who gives a little bit of insight on the whole Vidui section, the Ashamnu that we just read and the Al-Khayd that we're about to read. So she writes, 10 times during Yom Kippur, we recite the confessional, the Vidui. In this familiar acrostic, by the way, it's an acrostic, the Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, it goes in order of the alphabet. The first letter of each sin named corresponds to a letter of the Hebrew alphabet, with the final letter of the alphabet repeated for a total of 23 sins. It's as if to say, God, we know our shortcomings run from A to Z. Please forgive us. The Ashamnu, together with the Al-Khaits, a longer recitation of sins, Tony, that's what I think you were probably alluding to, gives us common wording, spoken repeatedly in community. We list our sins in the plural because we pray corporately, taking responsibility for the society we have jointly created and supporting our fellows and comrades. Using the plural ensures that no one is embarrassed by being singled out. The repetition ensures that no one is able to ignore the call or retreat into denial. 10 times over, the liturgy asks us to consider, how does each of these sins apply in my life, right? So I think maybe in part to answer your question, Tony, is that some of these things might come up and be like, we don't resonate with this. We don't, but at least it's another opportunity to be reflective. Like, you know what, let me just make sure I'm covering my bases. Have I actually held myself to account for this thing that I'm, as of now, sure I didn't do? But you know what, I've got 10 times to think about it. Maybe I did. And this is the chance to say sorry for it before these gates close. Rabbi Max Artz wrote of the Vidui, these confessions are prompted by the belief that sin distorts and diminishes the divine image in which human was created. Over the course of Elul and the days of awe, may the words of the prayers resonate in your heart, call to your awareness what needs to be healed, and inspire you to make positive changes. Let the divinity in you that is now encumbered be released in all its glory. So this next section of the Al-Khayd is much longer, right? Like I'm going to scroll here slowly, just so you see how much text we're talking about. And so what I'd like to do, I will keep my screen open, but also it's shared with you. Let's take 3 minutes at most to just read through them ourselves, because I'd like to now really take a moment when we're looking at such an exhaustive list to think about what should be there that isn't, what could be there that isn't, what perhaps we want to add this year. That's a very common ritual. Like I'm going to write down a couple, I'm going to bring them to shul with me, and at the end of my Al-Chayts, I've got the few that I want to add for the sin which we have committed, the Al-Chayts, Al-Chayt shechatanu, for the sin which we have sinned, yada, yada, yada. So I will slowly scroll if you want to look at my screen, but the source sheet is in the chat. Feel free to open it on your own screen and read through it for the next couple of minutes. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing for just a moment. I actually borrowed some questions from Rabbi Deborah Ornstein, who gave some context. So I'll read a few of these questions out, but I'd love for people just to respond to what feels right. So which of these involve misusing our bodies, facial expressions, affect? Which ones and how many are about using our words? Which speak of kavod, respect, dignity for ourselves and or others? Which ones are calling to you for personal growth this year? What does the confession teach about the role of our intentions in our transgressions or even our awareness? Does not knowing or being aware that we have even transgressed excuse our behavior? Does the traditional alchet say everything you need? Does it arouse enough ratzon, will, within you to make the changes your soul calls for? Or do you feel a need for new, a confession that speaks to today? So in terms of confessions that speak to today, it's in the source sheet that I gave a little comment there, but I'm going to share this little piece from My Jewish Learning here in the chat. So if folks are looking for inspiration for their own additionals, I'm giving this right here. I also think, Joyce, you were saying you have a supplement from last year that had some additional al-chets. Is that right?
That is correct. And I believe that we will get this when we have signed up for services.
Okay, great.
And it will be likely on the website as well.
Yeah, so I don't plan on going through the supplement that I just shared with you, but I think it has a lot of really beautiful ones. There are sins in there about racial justice, about climate justice, about just really rooting ourselves in the world that we're in and getting down to specifics, because I think that there is something so beautiful about the big picture umbrella form of admission to sins. And also, I think the more meaningful and sort of challenging parts of teshuva take place when we get into the nitty gritty, right? Accountability is about actually being able to acknowledge the specific, right? The real, the things that we've actually been party to. So I'll give us a couple moments before we transition to our last section that we're going to go through tonight. Any thoughts or reactions to the al-chet as we have it or as we imagine it could be? By the way, there doesn't have to be. I just, there was a lot of text to get through there, and I just wanted to be able to. Yeah, Sonia, please.
I just, as this, I forget her first name, Orenstein, I remember her last name.
Deborah, yeah.
Commented, I'm, again, really astounded, impressed, and amazed at the awareness of all the levels on which we betray one another, or we sin within our community by an expression on our face, or by doing something that we are not even aware of, which just prompts, of course, all kinds of, I would hope, self-scrutiny. But there's this level of awareness. Some of them are really obvious. The sins that are really obvious are obvious, but the ones that are more subtle, I'm repeating myself, I'm sorry.
No, but I'm glad you raised it up.
A certain kind of awareness of how we impact one another, even on the unconscious level, let me put it that way, and certainly with our nonverbal behavior as well as our verbal behavior.
Right. I talk about this all the time, or at least this time of year, that so much of teshuva is accountability, right? And it's you can't be accountable unless you're aware, unless you've acknowledged sin. And I'm grateful that you lifted it up, because even as I was reading through it, I think I sort of brushed through some of the ones that are sort of more passive and didn't even take note of them, which is like, right, when we just sort of instinctually roll our eyes or scoff or even think, whatever, And right, those are the things that actually do have an impact on each other. I mean, we all know the feeling of being on the other end of that, where someone doesn't even realize that they have done it, but nonetheless, that hurts all the more. They're like, oh, wow, that person did not like what I had to say, or it does not like me, and that can hurt. So to add more awareness to it, God willing, we confess to these things so that we can go into the next year and be like, okay, I got to be a lot more aware of.
And there's even if you don't mind my interrupting, there's one about the confusion of one's heart, which was very striking. That's really amazing.
Yeah.
Because that also is so compassionate. It reminds me, I just finished reading War and Peace, and it reminds me of Tolstoy and this compassion, that he has for people's lack of awareness and confusion, getting wrought up in all kinds of dramas that one almost can't help getting, wrought up in. But then we have to take a step back and say, well, what just happened? And what have I done? And if somebody is offensive, what might I have said or done to prompt that?
Right.
Like to Tony's point, I mean, I understand the confusion about, what if somebody did something because you said something, but it wasn't even really your fault, but somebody did it, and why should we take responsibility? Well, in a sense, we are all connected. And it's amazing, especially on a nonverbal level, how we are connected. And as you were saying, Aaron, just the rolling of the eyes or turning your head. If somebody is in conversation, they turn away or they block your space when we're in the communal setting. All of that, in a sense, can be thought of as sinful because it's hurtful to others.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hurtful to the community.
Yeah.
They're big sins and they're little sins, but they all wear away at our feeling of goodness and our trust in one another.
Yeah. One of the first pieces of professional feedback I ever got, I was a kid. I was like 17 years old working as a camp counselor at a sleepaway camp I grew up at. And a supervisor told me, Aaron, you got to work on the fact that when you are not happy with something, it is so obvious on your face. Like I had learned how to not say anything about it, like how to bite my tongue, like, well, what a big growth. But this supervisor very gently and thoughtfully was like, Aaron, you got to work on it. Like, it's so obvious what's going on your face. It's not serving you that you're not saying anything. You're saying just as much, and it was like, that's actually, I was really grateful for it. It was my first job. So anyway, I want to make sure we get a little bit of time for Naila. So Tony, please, I want to hear from you. You're muted.
And I was just struck by how many of these sins we're asking for forgiveness for that we've already been punished for. Like the sins that we've already had 40 lashes for, those sins that we've already given our sin offering for. Aren't those, when we have that, doesn't that kind of absolve us? Or am I misunderstanding?
No, that's a great question. I think that you're right. I think that, like, in a very technical sense, right? Like once a punishment has been carried out, like in the system of Jewish law, like you're clear. And so what is it? I think then what comes up then is that this is happening on a spiritual level, right? Maybe you've paid your penance, right? You are, things are cleared away with you and God because you've received your punishment. But to still call out to God and say, forgive us for the sin that we've created, I think maybe speaks to the humanity of, like, punishment doesn't necessarily make us feel like we have repented, right? Like that's a very progressive sort of model of restorative justice, right? That there's like, sure, people can be put behind bars for a crime that they did, but often if they're actually able to meet with the family of a victim or of a victim themselves and be able to offer a genuine and sincere apology, often much more healing comes from that than the person knowing this person's been, put away and is being punished. So perhaps that's what's going on, is that you've been punished, but you actually still haven't had your opportunity to say, I'm sorry to God, just because you've experienced what comes with it. But I'm really glad you brought that up. I hadn't thought about that before, and that's really something right there. Okay, we only have a little bit of time, so let's touch on Naila. So I'm going to read some headliner facts. All right, so Naila, the word means closing. Once referred to the gates of Jerusalem, it's now more spiritually understood as the gates of heaven are closing. So a fitting parallel thematically with Kol Nidre or opening service. I guess what I mean by that is just like this drama is happening again. We're like getting our last prayers in as the gates are closing. Like I'm picturing someone like running and like squeezing through the gates like right before they close, and you've got that little narrow space and you get through it, and then the walls come in on each other. Like that's to me the drama of Ne'ilah, which is like we're getting in like in almost every other service and holiday in Judaism, right? We would do like on Shabbat, we would pray Friday night, we would do Shachri, we would do Musaf, and we would do Mincha. So that would make the way we read like 8 sets of Vidui, or I mean 10 sets of Vidui. Well, it's because you're doing it silently and then out loud in your Amidah. So that would be 4 services. Ne'ilah is the only time where we have this 5th service, because Yom Kippur is like this heightened day. We've got to get one last shot at it as the gates are closing. So only day of the year where we do the Amidah 5 times, because it's this extra service. And this is, I think, a fun little fact. Despite the fact that Ne'ilah is intense, Ashrei is understood as like a joyous prayer. And so we say it during Mincha, but because it's a joyous prayer, we delay it to Ne'ilah because we're finally starting to feel like the tone shift as the day is ending, because there's such heaviness all day on Yom Kippur that like we're now, the end is in sight. You know, we're about to get through it. We're going to be inscribed, and we say Ashrei later. I know that we don't relate to Ashrei really as like such a joyous prayer, especially like the way we say it today, like Ashrei, Ashrei, it's like doesn't have that same sort of like, you know, but it's a nice idea, I think, that we push it to the end. So this is the opening Piyut El Nora Alila, that poem that we sing at BJ for Ne'ilah. Just a little bit of background on it, because you know this is a little bit more of the survey part of the course. It's attributed to Moshe Ibn Ezra, 11th century or so, Spain. It introduces Ne'ilah in the Sephardic tradition. This is a cool thing. Note that the name Moshe and the word Chazak, which means be strong, are spelled out in the first letters of each verse. So look, I bolded this mem, this shin, this hey, because his name is Moshe Ibn Ezra. Chet, Zayin, Kuf, Chazak. So I don't know if he's like talking himself up, or if he was sort of giving himself like, Moshe, be strong. Like you're here at the end of Yom Kippur, the gates are closing, but it's an interesting thing to see that he like gave a little nod to himself. Moshe, Chazak, Moshe, be strong. This poem is a plea for forgiveness, right? It's the last chance to get it in. It's a plea. And it entered the Ashkenazic Machzor in the 20th century, and so we say it as we open the Ark for Ne'ilah. By the way, we keep the Ark open for all of Ne'ilah. And the last stanza, which is adapted here, is not part of the original poem, but has been attached to it in many editions. So that note right there is from Machzor Lev Shalem, the one that we use. So let's just read through the text and invite in any reactions, and then say Laila Tov. Okay, God of awe, God of might, God of awe, God of might. Grant us pardon in this hour as your gates are closed this night. We who few have been from your, raise our eyes to heaven's height, trembling fearful in our prayer as your gates are closed this night. Pouring out our soul, we pray that the sentence you will write shall be one of pardoned sin as thy gates are closed this night. God, our refuge strong and sure, rescue us from dreadful plight. Seal our destiny for joy as your gates are closed this night. Grant us favor, show us grace, but of all who wrest the right and oppress, be you the judge as your gates are closed this night. Generations of our sires, strong in faith, walked in your light. As of old, renew our days as your gates are closed this night. Gather Judah's scattered, flock unto Zion's rebuilt site. Bless this year with grace divine as your gates are closed this night. May we all, both old and young, look for gladness and delight in many years to come as your gates are closed this night. I mean, I was gonna, look, the questions I wrote, which I adapted from another rabbi's source sheet. What does it mean to pour out our souls? how does this prayer and the change of the nusach at the beginning of Ne'ilah affect you? How powerful is the image of the gates closing for you? But honestly, reading it out loud, and obviously the translator chose to take the liberty to make it feel like a poem in English as well. But I can't help but be struck by what feels like a radical shift in tone. Like there's something very beautiful and uplifting about it. I'm curious if that resonates for anyone else, and what it feels like to know that we're concluding the day with this prayer. And Joyce is right. We use a very sort of upbeat, joyous melody. But yeah, Joyce, please.
Right. That's what I was actually going to say, that that at BJ, everything really shifts. Even how we ultimately sing together Zachrenu L'chaim. There's usually a shift in the actual melody that we use as well.
Yeah.
And plus, we're also, in that last prayer, we're also asking to be sealed. Instead of Katvedu, we're actually saying to be sealed, not just written, but sealed.
Right. Yeah. Right. It's a total shift. Shift.
And I think people know that Ne'ilah is actually, I believe it's a Ne'ilah that where Petach Lanu Shar, that everybody usually wants to hear Ari singing this, is actually very powerful.
Yeah, that is really powerful. I mean, I don't know what the connection was, and if it was just a choice by my community's clergy growing up. But what used to happen during Ne'ilah when I was growing up was the Ark was open, and every family unit would wait in line along from the Ark all the way to the edge wall, all the way down the wall, all the way to the back of the shul, and everyone got to have their minute as a family to offer their plea, their prayer for the year to come, right by the Torah scrolls, as a family or as an individual. And this was well before I was steeped in any learning, but I just remember thinking that this was a really special, it was a way to heighten an already special day, that we got this moment, this intimate moment in front of the whole community, but still this intimate moment as a family to get to offer this final plea before the Torah while these joyous tunes are happening. And just to only add to sort of the lighter tone, because it was a bunch of Jews in shul, of course the line gets very schmoozy, every 5 to 10 minutes of the repetition, the chazan would have to remind everyone we were still in services, because people were chatting with people before, in front and behind them as they waited for their turn. So I just
want to add before we stop that I believe it was last year during the pandemic, or maybe the year before, we were actually afforded an opportunity to go to the Ark.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's nice to know that
it wasn't during the service. It was actually a set time before. It was when there were still cameras in the sanctuary and we were not really fully in there yet. Got
it. So it seems like it's a tradition that has some, some notoriety, or that it's been used elsewhere. Anyway, I want to respect folks' time. It's been it's a long day, and I just want to thank you all for coming. It's been really great learning together, whether we've learned together before or if this was the first time. Shana Tova, Umetuka, however, wherever you'll be spending it, however you'll be spending it. But I appreciate you being here tonight, and look forward to crossing paths again soon.
Thank you, Aaron. It's always wonderful studying with you in the group. So thank you.
Thanks, Marissa, of course.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Shana Tova to everyone.
Have a good night, everyone.
Yes, o'clock, Aaron.
Thank you very much. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you. Shana Tova. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you. Shana Tova. Thank you. Good night. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov, everyone. Good night. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.